Welcome back to the show, folks. I know it has been a while. I'm sorry. You know, I had to recontemplate since uh, last year and find something that was more organic for me. And so I'm going to be changing up the show's format a little bit. I think it's going to be something you guys like. Um, Normally, it's going to be me. Sometimes I'm going to have some guests. But what I'm going to do is something that I'm really good at, and that is telling stories and telling them my way. Because let's face it, I'm good at telling stories. It's the only real skill I got. Well, that and running into burning buildings, but apparently that's not a very marketable skill if you're not a firefighter. So, what does that mean for today's show? Well, it means that I've got a story for you. But in order to get into the story, I got to ask you a question first. Have you ever heard the saying that the truth is stranger than fiction? I'm sure you hear it all the time, but what does that really mean? Well, my take on it is that when you look at things sometimes, you'll hear these outlandish stories that just seem amazing but make sense. But when you start looking into the true facts behind them, well, it's even more outlandish, even stranger. I think that's because when we're telling a story or when we're dealing with fiction, sometimes we've got to make stuff up as we go along, and we've got to fill in pieces that aren't necessarily there. We take liberties with stories. We take our own spin on it and put it in there to make it make sense. And, over time sometimes, that can change how it's viewed through history. Now think about it. 1,000 years from now, what are people going to think of Superman? In 1,000 years, when people see Superman, are they going to think that, it was just a story about some guy? Or are they really going to believe that there was an alien that walked among us who could leap tall buildings in a single bound and was stronger than a locomotive, faster than a speeding bullet, blah, blah, blah? Are our legends today going to be adapted and changed to be legends in the future that people will think we believed? Because let's not forget that there were legends in the past that have been adapted, and they've been changed. And when you look at the truth, you're not really finding the legend in there. Yes, something happened, but maybe it's not that. That's kind of where we're at. And today's legend, today's story, comes from my home state, comes from South Carolina, Charleston, in fact, my backyard. I live about 20 miles from there. And it is the story of the legendary, lovely Lavania Fisher. As the legend goes, America's first female serial killer. Let me tell you the story and then you'll understand. So, back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, right around the time the country was beginning, Charleston was one of the two biggest metropolises in the country. You got to think, we really only had 13 colonies. And of those 13 colonies, the big bustling ones were New York and South Carolina. New York was, where a lot of the industry and the production was going, and a lot of the high-end stuff was going. But down here in the South, in Charleston and Savannah and Georgetown and Beaufort, where those ports were, that was where a lot of the more cash crops were being traded out, because we had farming here. We had the plantations down here. We had money just flowing right out of Charleston, left and right. So Charleston was a really big, bustling area. And just like any big, bustling area, Charleston had its share of crime. They say that Charleston had its share of pirates and it had its share of privateers. And it's weird that the two of them are described different, because they were basically the same thing. Just it depended on whose flag they sailed under before they threw up the old Jolly Roger. But it had criminals on land as well, highwaymen, robbers who would attack merchants and travelers on the road and take their money and sometimes their lives. And on the road from north into Charleston, there was an epidemic of wealthy travelers just disappearing out of nowhere, just boop, gone. No wealthy traveler here. They would be on their way and they would never make it to Charleston. They'd be seen somewhere, but they weren't seen in Charleston. That's for dang sure. They were getting robbed left and right and disappearing. And that's where we get into Lavania Fisher. Lavania Fisher was the wife to John Fisher, and she was referred to as lovely Lavania. She was this very beautiful, very prim and proper, very stern woman with a kind of sniveling meat sack of a husband, John, who just, traded up. And John and Lavania ran the 6 Mile Wayfarer Inn. Now, back then, what an inn was it was a house, basically, with extra rooms, where as travelers were coming through, they could stop and they could feed and water their horses, let them rest, get a bite to eat, get some sleep, maybe play some cards, maybe get a little companionship. Who knows? There were lots of things that went on at these inns. They were the saloons of the road. Now, if you've seen a Western, you know what a saloon is. Same thing. And they ran the 6 Mile Inn. So named because it was 6 miles from Charleston. Now you're thinking 6 miles, that's not very far. I drive 6 miles every day in about 5 minutes. Well, yeah, we do today. But remember, horses didn't go 60 miles an hour. Horses usually traveled comfortably about 15. So 6 miles was a good trip. So the 6 Mile Inn was probably the place where a lot of people stopped in. Now, Lavania would always greet the guests, and she was always so gentle and nice. And she would talk to them, ask them questions about who they were. She was always interested in what they did for work or whether or not they had a rich family. She always wanted to know about them. She was interviewing them, it seemed like, getting all the information that they could. And the one she really liked, she would offer her special tea brewed with oleander. Now, if you don't know what oleander is, it's a poison that will stop your heart. And so she would serve these gentlemen their tea and then send them up to their room. And in some versions of the story, it was a special room that she had rigged with a mechanical bed so that all she had to do was pull a lever outside, and it would drop these men who were already poisoned into a pit filled with spikes that would stab into them and kill them. And then, of course, they'd go down and loot the body, cover it with lye, and get rid of the body. Now, this, of course, went on for quite a while, and the people in Charleston, they got really angry about it. So the people of Charleston, they decided that they were going to do something about it. They formed a vigilante mob. Now, this vigilante mob that had been put together in the town of Charleston started going out to the inns. And, of course, they went out to, the different inns along the way. And it turns out that there were quite a few. There was the 2 Mile Inn, the 3 Mile Inn, the 4 Mile, 5 Mile, and 6 Mile, and probably a 7th. We never hear about the 7 Mile Inn. We just hear about, really, 3, 4, 5, and 6. And that's because when they got to the 3 Mile Inn, they did catch some ne'er-do-wells and decided to burn that one to the ground. Now, at the 4 Mile Inn, they met with the owners, checked everything out, and everything seemed fine. When they got to the 5 Mile Inn, the occupants refused to come out to the mob. Now, granted, if it were me, I wouldn't have come out to the mob either. I mean, I'm not going to go out there when there's an angry mob wanting to burn me alive. But because they didn't come out to the mob, well, the mob set the house on fire around them. Now, it's unknown if the people in the house then ran out of the house or if they burned to death in the house. But whatever reason, the message got to the Fishers at the 6 Mile Inn before the mob did of what was going on. So when the mob showed up, Lavania walked out with John cowering behind her and welcomed them into her home, inviting them to take a look around. Well, this mob did just that. They went and they took a look around, and they didn't find anything that they thought was out of place at the time. In fact, everything looked normal. Maybe they had taken care of the highwaymen. They weren't sure. But they were pretty sure that they needed to keep going. But they also needed to report back. So they let a young man named David Ross stay at the 6 Mile Inn with the Fishers. And they proceeded along their way, torches and pitchforks heading down the road, going to kill someone else. Well, as soon as they were gone, 2 men accosted David Ross. They began beating him and kicking him. Lavania walked in, and David looked up at her, and he pled with her for her to do something to help him in some way. And as John stood behind her, She scowled at him and then beat him about the head, smashed his head through a plate glass window. Now, this gave David a chance to escape because there was a big open plate glass window. So David lit out of there. The two men lit out in hot pursuit. Lavania and John apparently stayed at the inn. Now, as David was running and the two men were chasing, a merchant by the name of John Peebles arrived at the 6 Mile Inn. He was unaware of what was going on. He didn't know that there was a vigilante justice taking place, and he had absolutely no clue that he was stepping into the web of a serial killer like Lavania Fisher. Lavania put on her smile, welcomed him in, asked him her questions, and then offered him a cup of tea. Unfortunately, John didn't like tea. So when Lavania wasn't looking, he poured the tea out and went, that was good. I enjoyed that. That was a great glass of tea. And then Lavania showed him to the room and bid him good night. Now, for some reason, John Peebles, the hair on the back of his neck started to stand up, and he decided that instead of sleeping in the nice, comfortable bed that was before him, he was going to sleep in the chair by the door. So that's where he decided to go pass out. In the middle of the night, he began to hear the mechanizations going and noises outside the door, and he awoke to see the bed drop and realized that he was in danger. So he leapt out of the window and ran to the magistrate, catching up with David Ross when he got there. The two of them immediately reported what was happening at the Fisher's Inn. Magistrates sent out deputies, and they went to go and capture Lavania and her husband and the highwaymen that had assaulted David Ross. Now, when they got there with their big posse, John Fisher did something amazing. He stood up and he said, "No, don't hurt my wife. We'll surrender, we'll surrender." Lavania came out with her head held high, completely denying it, calling David a liar. Hey, he's lying. Of course he is. He's obviously lying. Everybody knew he was a liar, right? Well, wrong. And they spent the next 13 months in jail awaiting trial. Well, I say they spent the next 13 months in jail, but technically they got out a couple of times. So a few times, Lavania and John tried to escape. They were kept in a 6x8 cell together, and of course, Lavania never broke her improper attitude. But apparently at one point, John and a partner were able to get out using the old-fashioned sheet blanket rope. And they got down and they were waiting for Lavania to lower herself down when the rope broke. Now, John could have done the smart thing. He could have ran, couldn't have gotten away, could have saved his life. But he could not leave his beloved Lavania. So he just waited there to get picked back up and put right back in the same cell. They made other attempts, got just as far, and then their trial came. Now, Lavania, she not guilty. No way. No one is going to do anything like this. And of course, John was counting on the fact that they wouldn't hurt Lavania because she was a married woman. But after the trial, while doing the sentencing, not sentences, I'm speaking sentences, but we're talking about a sentencing, two different things. During the sentencing, the judge considered it and he said, "We're just going to hang John first. Then Lavania won't be married. She'll be a widow, and it'll be perfectly fine to hang her." So that was the plan, to hang John and then to hang Lavania. They filed an appeal, expecting that maybe, just maybe, some miracle, they'd live. But the appeal didn't work. And once the appeal was decided that it was not going to be held up, the execution was scheduled. They paraded John down the street, and the onlookers threw rocks and rotten fruit and tomatoes at him and yelled at him, and he sniveled his way through. And they climbed him up on the gallows, and they put the noose around his leg, and they asked, John, do you have any last words? And he looked out at the crowd and he went, she made me do it. I'm sorry. Then they hung him. That was the end of John Fisher. What a sniveling man, right? On the other hand, Lavania, when they paraded her down the street, she walked as if she was royalty. She demanded to be hung in her fine wedding dress with all its adornments and beauty. As she walked, she earned the name Lovely Lavania, looking like a princess. No one dared throw a rock at Lavania. They all feared her. For some reason, the air that she carried just passed doom towards them. And she climbed the gallows, her head held high, and waited for the noose to be strung about her neck, and then looked out at the crowd. They asked her if she had any last words, and she said, in a cold and vehement voice, if you have any messages for the devil, give them to me now, for I will be with him shortly. As soon as she said that, she stepped off the gallows and hung herself. She took matters into her own hands, as it were. So, the actual story of what happened is really different from the legend of Lavania Fisher. Because in truth, nothing's really known about Lavania until 1819, when she showed up, of course, in the news and in the courts. You know, she was married to John Fisher, sure, yeah, that's known. And they owned the 6 Mile Wayfarer Inn, 6 miles outside of Charleston. But other than that, it's pretty much a blank slate. Nobody really knows where she came from or that much about her. Now, what we do know is that they ran the 6 Mile Wayfarer Inn, her and John, and that at the time, there were a lot of disappearances and reports of highwaymen robbing. Now, the reason being is that John did run a gang of highwaymen out of both the 5 Mile and 6 Mile Inns. So, of course, Charlestonians, being the people that they are, they formed a vigilante mob to go out and find these highwaymen. And, of course, they stopped at the 3 Mile and the 4 Mile Inn, starting their path down, and they found nothing. People cooperated, nothing was found, and then they got to the 5 Mile Inn. Of course, in the 5 Mile Inn were some highwaymen, but they didn't know that. But the people at the 5 Mile Inn were uncooperative. And so the mob set the house on fire. The people escaped and ran, and the 5 Mile Inn burnt to the ground. A word of this got to John and Lavania, so when the mob showed up, John and Lavania were like, hey, we're friendly. And everybody liked John and Lavania. They thought they were a nice couple. I mean, Lavania was a beautiful woman by all accounts. And she was supposedly very sweet and polite and talkative. And, you know, John was a very nice and prominent businessman who ran this nice inn. So they let the mob do their search and do their thing. And the mob was pretty much convinced that everything was okay. They left its youngest member, David Ross, there with John and Lavania so that they could report back. David could go and report back to town and let everybody else know, hey, you know, we've made it to the 6 Mile Inn. We haven't found anything. We're going to keep going. That was their plan, was they were going to keep going. And David was supposed to go and report back. Well, after the mob left, again, David was accosted because the 2 men from the 5 Mile Inn showed up and found him. And they accosted David, and David looked to Lavania again for help. And Lavania looked to John, who kind of gave her a look, and then she assaulted David and threw him out a window. And, of course, that allowed David to escape. David escaped, and he was pursued by these 2 robbers from the 5 Mile Inn, 2 highwaymen. Lavania, of course, stayed there and cleaned up, and as she was cleaning up, up arrived John Peebles. Now, of course, she talked to John Peebles and questioned him and got his information, but unlike the legend, it turns out that Lavania's job was to decide whether or not to send people down to meet the highwaymen that would be waiting in the road between the 6 Mile and the 5 Mile Inn. So when she determined that John Peebles was worth robbing, she sent him down the road to where the two men were chasing David Ross. Now, of course, as John Peebles went down the road, he was met by John Fisher and the other men, who accosted him and robbed him, but let him leave with his life. And that is the important part of this, because David Ross was making his way to the magistrate when John Peebles rode up on his horse, and the two of them reported the events that happened, and John Peebles identified Lavania Fisher as asking all these questions, and John Fisher as one of the men who robbed him. The magistrates sent out their deputies. They arrived armed to the teeth, ready to go down fighting. But John Fisher stepped forward and protected his wife Lavania and said that they would surrender. And they surrendered without a fight. Lavania was taken to prison, the whole time pleading her innocence, saying she was just doing what her husband wanted. She never harmed any of these men. She didn't mean to push David out the window. It was an accident. She claimed her innocence the entire time. Which, again, not completely off from the story, but we'll keep going. So, just like in the legend, Lavania and John were housed in the Old City Jail in Charleston in a 6x8 cell for 13 months before they had trial. And during that time, they did try to escape, but they were not successful. Of course, the blanket story still holds true. The blanket broke, Lavania was stuck, and John wouldn't leave her. Now, it's not said that he sat there and waited, but he was trying to get Lavania out when he was captured. Now, when the trial came, John and Lavania both proclaimed their innocence and were both found guilty. Found guilty of assault, cattle rustling, and highway robbery. Highway robbery at the time was a capital offense, punishable by death. And they were sentenced to be hanged. An appeal was filed by John and Lavania. John's appeal, John tried to say that he had sought God and sought the solace of a reverend. He had a reverend friend that came with him, that he had spoken with and been speaking with, trying to find peace with what was happening. This did not earn him any mercy. In fact, the judge decided that made him more prepared to go to the gallows. Lavania didn't have any priest or anything to come inside with her. And she just, again, proclaimed asking for mercy, stating that she didn't do these things, that she was just there. And she wasn't guilty. It wasn't her fault. But the people of the city of Charleston weren't hearing it. And so Lavania's sentence was kept. The execution was ordered. Now, unlike the whole they paraded them through the streets and the legend, the story is actually a little bit more simpler. It was a carriage ride from the courthouse straight to the gallows as soon as the appeal was denied. John went first. Now, we don't know if that was because the judge didn't want to hang a married woman, or if that's just because they thought John should go first. Now, his last words were a prepared statement that he had written, in which he forgave the crowd and the people of the city of Charleston for blaming him for these crimes, that God had given them the ability to forgive them because he was an innocent man they were hanging, and they were going to be forgiven. Now, he had hoped that this ploy would draw mercy from the crowd, and they would say, no, don't hang him. But, no, that didn't happen. Short drop, sudden stop, boom, John Fisher was gone. Lavania Fisher was a bit of a different story. Lavania came out crying and begging and screaming for help. And the closer she got to the gallows, the more she cried and begged and screamed. But her screams went from those of fear and of sorrow to those of anger. She began to curse and spew blasphemy and hatred at the people who were letting her be led to her death. She was wearing rags. She had been reduced to this tattered woman, and they were just letting her be killed, and she didn't believe that she deserved it. She cussed at them, she yelled at them. As they put the noose around her neck, she struggled, and then finally she grew quiet. And the priest approached to give her some words of wisdom, but she said, save it. Do not want your words. And she looked out at the crowd. And she said, if you have any messages that need to go to hell, you can give them to me, and I will take them. And she looked over at the executioner and nodded. And he pulled the lever, and the platform dropped, and Lavania Fisher was hung until dead. Now, does the truth kind of match up with the story a little bit? Are there questions in the truth that aren't answered, that are answered in the story? Yeah. But it's even stranger when you consider that Lavania in the truth doesn't appear to be this, maniacal villain. But in the story, they paint Lavania as just this wicked queen character. And it really makes you question it. Truth is stranger than fiction. All the time, when we hear about it, it's always the person you don't suspect that's the serial killer or the murderer. So maybe, in truth, Lavania, quiet little, beautiful Lavania, really was a psychopathic serial killer. But what she was not was lovely Lavania Fisher, the vicious first female serial killer in America. Anyway, folks, that's the story of Lavania Fisher. I really hope you guys liked it. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments. Let me know what you think. Remember to go over to Anchor and click on the support button. You guys can support by just simply pledging $1 a month, $5 a month, whatever you could. Really appreciate it. And also, go to Amazon.com, look up Jonathan Phoenix, and grab one of my books, Through the Flames or Redcoats. Out now, available to read. Really great stories. I'm sure you'll love them. And I'll see you next week.